Well, a very good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 14th of March, 2024. It's 1 p.m., and you're watching the Lite Bite Lunch. I'm delighted today to be joined by a wonderful, wonderful lady, Phyl Herbert, who has a remarkable tale to tell. So, for the next 30 minutes, pull up a chair, grab a cup of coffee, sit back, relax, and enjoy a Lite Bite Lunch. Good afternoon. Yes, indeed, it is the Lite Bite Lunch. And as I said, we are joined by the lovely lady, Phyl Herbert, who's clearly a very popular lady. Because as we have just started, we already have a message coming in for you, Phyl.
Oh,
Imelda's saying, looking forward to hearing your voice today.
oh, lovely.
So thank you very much for joining us, Imelda, and hope we'll be seeing a lot more of you in future shows to come. So, Phyl, maybe the best thing we'll do, because a lot of people, your name won't be familiar to a lot of people who may be watching. So maybe it's best if I ask you to give us in about a minute, minute and a half, just a snapshot of who you are, etc., so people know where we're going to be going with the conversation.
Very good. Well, first of all, Rory, thank you very much for inviting me on. I live in Dublin and I'm a woman in my late 70s. So I suppose I spent a lot of my years teaching. And while teaching, I was also very much involved in theatre. And then I discovered writing. So I came to writing quite late in life, and it's sort of a regret that I didn't concentrate on writing at a much earlier age. But the older you get, I think the more focused you become. And I'm now taking writing seriously. So so far, I've written a collection of short stories, and I've just had a memoir published, and hopefully I go on. I'm very lucky to be part of a very good writing group called Web, and there's a lot of established writers there, and we get great feedback from each other. So that's where I'm at, Rory.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, as I said, I'm so happy that we managed to tie down a date that was going to work for both of us to get you in, because I appreciate that while a lot of people at your stage of life would be planning on taking it quite easy, I know you're extremely active and you're always on the go. So it's great that we managed to tie it in. So the story we're going to discuss of yours today takes us back to 1960s Dublin. As a teenager growing up in Dublin in the 60s, I mean, obviously Dublin was a very, very different place then to now. So tell us a little bit, what was life like in Dublin in the 60s for a teenager?
Well, it's interesting. The past is always defined by the present, isn't it? Like in the 60s, we had no mobile phones, no computers. The digital age didn't exist. So entertainment was either going to the pictures or going to the theatre. But for me, I think the defining moment in my teenage years was leaving the convent school in Terranure, Presentation Convent. Everything was black and white. And then going to Sandymount High School, where things automatically became coloured.
Yes.
And I think in the 60s, we started just to open up a little bit to the world. Like we had JFK, well, of course, the death of JFK, 1963,
Yes.
and then Vietnam. And we had the beginning of Irish television, television.
Hmm.
And I remember in Sandymount High School, we had Charles Mitchell teaching us elocution. So we were all in a fantasy world trying to find out who we are. And I suppose we're still struggling with that question, Rory.
Yeah,
Who are
no,
we?
I mean, in one way, it was a much simpler time in the sense you could get up to things then that you couldn't now with it being such a digital age. I mean, I even, as I may have mentioned to you when we spoke during the week there, I look back to the early 2000s when I was living in Crete, and there was we didn't have every other person on mobile phones. Yes, we had phones, but they didn't have anything like the level of technology. Social media wasn't at the same level of technology. So, I mean, just trying to imagine stepping back that little bit further. Thankfully, I
Yeah,
didn't actually arrive till the 70s, so I only have what people have told me about the 60s
I know.
to work from. But it certainly was like it was a very different time, and I think that's important for people to remember as we go through your story. Um, so you in the 60s ended up falling pregnant.
Yes. And it sort of was, well, I had, I was fascinated by theatre.
Yeah.
And theatre in the 60s was very exciting, really, because you had an awful lot of drama groups, you had an awful lot of basement theatres. And I went with a friend to the Unicorn Theatre in North Great Georgia Street one night. And that was the beginning of a story that was to last probably the rest of my life. I met a man there who was directing a J.B. Keane play, The Highest House on the Mountain. So he told me I would suit the main part. And of course, I'd no experience at all. So I just fell hopelessly head over heels in love with him.
Yeah.
And of course, it was later I discovered he was married, but there was no coming back from where I was.
Yes.
So in those days, there was no contraception, but I doubted I would have been looking for it because it was hardly a word that was in the ether.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It was
Yeah.
like the
So
level of, and it's funny though, just to make the link there where you made mention about it being a John B. Keane play and Sandymount High School. And as it happens, John B. Keane's brother Dennis
that's
later,
right,
later
Dennis.
went on to be a teacher and a very, very good teacher in Sandymount High School.
That's absolutely right because I met him later. I was in another J.B. Keane play and Dennis took one of the parts.
Yes.
So then he lived near me, so we would bump into each other. That's right. That's absolutely
Yes.
right.
Dennis, I stage managed a couple of shows for Dennis. I actually appeared on stage with Dennis, and
Oh,
yes, so it's
I didn't know
amazing how small a world it actually is.
I didn't know you were involved in theatre, Rory.
Oh yeah, still am. Well, only recently got back onto theatre, but and it's an area I actually my first foray into theatre was in 1986, so that's one we can chat about another time.
Okay.
It,
Yeah.
I- um, so um, you fell head over heels. You ended up pregnant. You went.
Yeah.
You spoke to the man, and his solution was, "Oh, we'll send you to England for an abortion."
Well, first of all, when I told him I was pregnant, he said to me, "Are you sure I'm the father?" Which was devastating for me because it was the first time I ever had sex, and he knew
Yes.
that. So it was utter. I was working in Aer Lingus at the time, and it would have brought shame on me, shame on my family. It was the worst sin you could commit to have sex outside of marriage. So I told nobody except the author. And I went to a doctor and she set me up with everything, a German doctor, in fact. So I stayed in a hostel in London and she booked me into St. Patrick's Mother and Baby Home on the Navan Road for when the time was ripe for the baby to arrive. So during my time in London, I stayed in a hostel in Euston Square. And I think I lived in fantasy land. I really wasn't in the real world, you know.
Yeah.
I kept feeling I was part of a play and that suddenly it would end. And I don't know, I was just very silly. I was just being protected from thinking about the real world, I think. But I came back then in July. This was 1967. And the father of the child met me at Belfast Airport and drove me to St. Patrick's. And I was there for 6 weeks until the baby was born. Well, the baby was born, but I stayed there for 6 weeks afterwards.
Right.
Until she was adopted.
Yes. Now, before we get into the rest of it, there is one question. Well, first of all, we do have a couple of comments coming in for you.
Oh.
So, Marie Maxwell, A Mighty Small World, Rory and Phil. And Catherine Dunn saying, a lovely interview.
Oh, thank you.
Right. But as you know, Phil, guests to come on. As a nation in Ireland, we love talking about food and we love everything to do with food. When things are going well, we celebrate with food. When we're down in the dumps, we drown our sorrows with food. So one question that we ask every guest that comes on, what for you is the perfect light bite lunch?
Oh, lovely question, Rory. Well, I think my favorite is pasta. And I always have pasta in my cupboards. And in my fridge, I always have smoked salmon and spinach and cheese. So that would be something that I'd whip up very quickly. But I live in Rathmines now, and there's an awful lot of takeaway places. So I just live 2 minutes away from Subway. So if I'm lazy, I go in there and I'll get a meatball wrap with loads of salad.
Nice.
Or else a sandwich.
Very nice, very nice choices. And yes, some people are saying smoked salmon, pasta, cheese sounds superb. Real soul food.
Very tasty.
Yes.
And quick.
Yeah. So Maggie Gary, they're saying Ireland treated single women very poorly as a state and a society.
Yes.
Right, indeed. And we have another message from Muriel to say she absolutely loved your book.
Oh, thank you, Muriel.
Right. So let's take it then. You've arrived into the mother and baby home. Can you set a scene for us? And I know we've all heard the absolute horror stories. We've all heard others come back and say, well, it could have been a lot worse than it was. In the eyes of a girl arriving into the mother and baby home, what was your reaction?
Well, I was really numbed. That was my first reaction. I just couldn't believe where I was. And, you know, I'd love to be able to contact some of the women that were there the year I was there, 1967. I found the nuns, well, the head nun now reminded me of the head nun from school. She was very bossy. And when I arrived with the father of the child, she spoke to him. I was ignored. But when I went then, when I was shown my room in the dormitory, I found all the nuns extremely pleasant. And it was like a boarding school. There was a lot of girls around my age, some older, some younger. And there was a feeling of fun about the place. I know that sounds ridiculous. But at night time, there was a lovely girl I met. She had just had her baby. She was a trainee nurse and she was working in the nursery where you had just loads of white cots. Her baby was in one of the cots and she sort of looked after me, told me what to expect. But I never had to work. Like, I think people confuse it with the Magdalene laundry. It wasn't a laundry. I don't remember girls working. Now, I do remember girls working in the sewing room, but I never had to do a tap.
Right.
Whether I got away with murder or not, I don't know. But like every evening, we'd meet in the kitchen and there'd be jokes told. And the big thing was we were dying to have our babies adopted so that we could lead the place feeling free, born again virgins type of thing. So that was the bubble that contained us. And I think everything just set in afterwards when the reality dawned and you realized, there was something missing.
Yeah. Absolutely. And again, I think that's one of the things that I wanted to get across because, as I said, we've heard so many horror stories, and it's nice to hear from somebody who has been there as a teenager and is actually saying, do you know what? It actually wasn't that bad.
No.
Right. And it's lovely to hear about the camaraderie, that type of thing. I see Monique has a message for us as well there.
Ah,
Um, how lucky she was to have a good man like that supporting her.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And little did she know that he was married and he'd given a false name for himself and for myself.
Yes.
He made up my name.
It's
But
just
when I was there, Rory, my parents didn't know. Nobody knew where I was. They thought I was in France. So the nuns set up a French address for me so that I could send. Well, they had their mother convent in Rue du Bac in Paris. But I sent my letters there, and they sent my letter to my parents with a French envelope. So they colluded in my fantasy.
absolutely unbelievable, really and truly. Um, so let's now take a huge jump forward. In 1993, you were
Yes,
sitting at home having your breakfast, and the postman arrives at the door dropping an envelope through.
yes, yes. It was from the Eastern Health Board, and it was to say that my child was looking for me. That they had a letter. They discovered a letter that she'd been looking for me 6 years earlier, and that some social worker just discovered the letter because they had no system then of twinning, the child with the birth mother. So I was called to a place in Clonskee to meet the social worker, and he told me then that he had found Bronach was her name, the name
Right.
she was born with, and he then set up a situation whereby we could meet each other for the first time. So she was 26 at the time.
Right. Now, in your own circumstance at that time, were your family aware of this?
No,
No.
no, they weren't
How,
aware.
right. How do you sit a family down and actually broach that subject to say, um, listen, there's something you need to know from the past?
Yes, that was very difficult. I got a letter from my daughter. Before we met, we were asked to write letters to each other explaining who we were, what our circumstances were. So I just felt a huge need to tell my mother, especially. And when I went up to see my mother, my brother was living with her at the time. So, of course, I went to read the letter and then I broke down. And I remember my brother Noel took the letter out of my hands and read it to my mother. So she was gobsmacked. And I remember when I was leaving that day, she said to me, "You must have thought I was a terrible mother that you couldn't tell me." So that was a bit heartbreaking. But there was no way in the world I could have told her because there was 11 in our family. Well, we weren't all there at the same time. Circumstances would never have accepted me bringing in a baby into the house.
Yeah. No,
First of all, I'd have had to give up my job. Well, I did give up my job, of course, in Aer Lingus. And, the whole social scene then was, illegitimacy, damaged goods. You were completely finished as a woman if you had sex outside of marriage, not to mention a baby.
Oh yeah, like the whole stigma side of it was astronomical, absolutely.
Yes, yeah,
But I'm trying to come to terms with how you actually sit down and have that conversation, not sure how it's going to be received.
yeah.
On one side, at least, you had grown as an individual over the years. So it wasn't like it wouldn't be as bad as a teenager coming home to say it. But I mean, I really can't, and I struggle to imagine what you were feeling at the time, trying to explain to people, look, at this is just how things went.
Yes, it's very interesting that you put up that scenario, Rory, because even then, back then, with my siblings, like they were all married with children, but none of us had the vocabulary to talk about it.
Yeah.
And there was very little said among the siblings. Well, there was nothing nasty ever said,
Hmm.
but it was never a great source of conversation. Well, my daughter did meet my mother eventually, and they got on extremely well. And my mother was terrific with her, like she had thought out the meeting thoroughly. But the rest of the family had difficulty.
Yes.
And I think it would have been possibly guilt that they didn't notice I was pregnant, or else they probably thought I was very stupid that I didn't say something. But there was never any deep conversation about it. It was my friends really who supported me at the time the most.
Right. Just as I said, it's such a remarkable story. So tell us, when you actually did manage to meet your daughter, how did that actually, like, how did the meeting go? You've had exchanged letters, and then you actually got to meet face to face.
Well, when I met her first, but when she sort of looked at me as I came into the hotel to meet her, she was there with the social worker. And it was like she was thinking, who the hell is this woman coming towards me? But when we sat down and relaxed, just felt an immediate bond with her. Um, she was just so easy to talk to, very bright girl, very caring. And it was a bit like the roles were switched. It was a bit like she became the mother and I was the awkward daughter. So we got on really well. We had such a lot in common. And it was for the first 10 years, it was like a honeymoon period. And then it all went a little bit askew.
Right. And how is the relationship at this stage?
Well, there isn't really much of a relationship now. You know, she knew about the memoir. I showed her the memoir at the initial stages, and she asked me to take out certain parts of it.
Hmm.
Well, we sort of had a few misunderstandings, and that were never really ironed out. And it's that whole thing of communication. It was just a no-go area after a while. So I think we met about 2 years ago, and that was the end.
Right.
That was the end. So we wished each other well. And, you know, she has a far different history to mine, and she would have her own siblings, you
Yes.
know, that the family she was adopted into, there was two existing children there. So I'm not part of that. And that's a big sadness that it hasn't worked out better.
Yeah.
But, you know, I have to accept that.
That's it. We do have. I have to say, thank you everybody who's been commenting along the way. If we were to use every single comment, we'd be here. We'd actually need another hour, hour and a half to cover everything.
Oh, that's
Um,
great.
do you feel that your child was taken away from you, or do you feel you gave her up willingly?
Oh, I gave her up willingly. Oh, it was never taken away. Like when I was in St. Patrick's, no child was taken away. I was given up. Um, I knew it was the best thing at the time, and at least I believed that I was doing the best thing at the time, that she should go to a family. And I knew that if she came to my family, that it wouldn't have been a very good start for her in life, because I wouldn't have had a job. There was no room in the house. There was a very poor atmosphere around the whole area of was no such, well, we didn't know the term single mothers then.
Yes.
So I thought I was doing the best.
No, and again, and I think that is so key to this story. And for people, until you're actually in a situation like that, making the decision to do what is best for the child, which may be heartbreaking for the mother to make, but having to make that decision, what is best for the child, is so important. And
Yes.
and I think you are so brave to have been able to take that. So Phyl, time is very nearly running out on us.
Okay.
What is the name of the book?
The Price of Silence, and it's published by menmabooks.eu, and it's in bookshops now. It's in Books Upstairs, in Rathmines, Alan Hanna's, Charlie Burns from Galway, and it's in a few bookshops. Unfortunately, my publisher doesn't have a distributor, but his website is menmabooks.eu.
Right, and we will put that up after the show on all the social medias as well. I have had a request, and again, if you're happy to, I'm more than happy to, asking, will we bring you back on again? Will we do another? Well, it'll be a half an hour. We won't stretch it to an hour, because that's.
I see Roll New Blair. You asked that question.
Yes, but we will certainly, if you're happy to come on again, Phyl, we'll happily bring you on again.
Rory.
Because I think it is a fascinating story, and I think we could delve so much more into it. But I think it's something that we need to do in small segments, because I know it can certainly be triggering. And to anyone who's been watching who has been affected, please don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help somewhere. There is a huge amount of assistance out there. And while it may not always be easy in the long term, you will be much better off if you ask for help and get the help that is available to you. Don't, for no reason should you be afraid of any circumstance you're in. And just to say to anyone that may have been triggered by anything we have discussed, Phyl, unfortunately, as I said, the clock has pretty much run out on us. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, what is the best way for them to reach out to you?
Well, I'm on Facebook under Phyl Herbert. I think that's possibly the best way.
Right.
Or my email is phylana@gmail.com. PHYLANNA@gmail.com.
Great. Listen, Phyl, it has been an absolute pleasure. I really do appreciate you taking the time to join us today. We will be back in 2 weeks' time with another guest, another chat. And until then, I think we will bid you all a very good afternoon and have a great Patrick's weekend. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rory. Thank you.